Be'ezras Hashem, with God's help, we're beginning a new set of laws. Hilchos, Maaser, Sheini, v'netar Rabbi. The laws of the second tithe and fruit that grows in the fourth year. We know that for the first 3 years of produce's growth, you can't eat it. It's called orla. But in the fourth year, it doesn't just convert into being regular fruit. There's a year of holiness, where all the fruit has to be treated in a holy way, and it's treated in the exact same way that Maaser Sheini, the second tithe, is treated. Therefore, the Rambam puts the laws together. But mainly, we're going to be focused on Maaser Sheini. Yesh bichlala and tesha mitzvahs. The Rambam always does this. He gives us the list of the mitzvahs that are going to be discussed here. 9 mitzvahs coming up in this set of laws. Shalish mitzvahs aseh, v'sheish mitzvahs loisa aseh. 3 positive mitzvahs, 2 negative. V'zehu pratan, these are their details. Aleph, lahafrish Maaser Sheini. Mitzvah number 1, to separate the second tithe. After you do the truma, after you do the Maaser, second tithe. Beis, shaloi lahoitzi damav, bishar tzarchei b'nei adam. If you do end up converting produce into money, because we're going to see that ideally you'd separate the produce and you take the produce to Jerusalem. But if you're too far, or if you have too much, you convert it into money, you take the money to Yerushalayim, but you're not allowed to spend the money on any other human needs, chutz me'achila u'shtiya v'sicha, besides for eating, drinking, and anointing yourself with creams or oils. Gimel, shalei la'achlei betuma, it's forbidden to eat Maaser Sheini in a state of ritual impurity. Daled, shalei la'achlei ba'aninus, it's forbidden to eat Maaser Sheini in a state of biblical mourning. Aninus means pain or mourning. As we're going to see, it refers to the initial stage, just the first day of after a person's relative passes away. Hey, shalei lechol Maaser Sheini shel dagan chutz l'Yerushalayim. It's forbidden to eat grain Maaser Sheini outside of the city of Jerusalem. Vav shalei lechol Maaser tiresh chutz l'Yerushalayim. It's a separate prohibition not to eat or not to drink wine Maaser Sheini outside of Jerusalem. Zayin shalei lechol Maaser yitzhar chutz l'Yerushalayim, not to eat the Maaser Sheini of oil outside of Yerushalayim. It's all really the same concept, but it's 3 separate mitzvahs in the 613. Ches liyos netar Rabbi kulei kodesh. All fruits that grow in the 4th year of a tree's production are all holy. V'dinai lehe'achel b'Yerushalayim lebaylav k'Maaser Sheini lechol davar. And the law is that it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim by its owners, just like Maaser Sheini in every respect. And tes lehisvados vidui ha'Maaser. Every couple of years, you have to go to the Holy Temple and declare what's called the confession of the Maaser. It's not really a confession, more of a declaration that you've given all the gifts from your agricultural produce as you're supposed to. The explanation of these 9 mitzvahs is coming in the following 11 chapters, God willing, the laws of Maaser Sheini. Perek Rishon, chapter 1. Says the Rambam, Achar shemafrishin Maaser Rishon b'chol shana. After we set aside the first tithe, which goes to the Levi every year, mafrishin Maaser Sheini. You need to also separate a second tithe, a second 10%. Shenemar, because it says, aser to aser. Eis kol tevu azarecha. You need to take a tithe, a tenth, from all the grain of your land, of your seeds. Now we already know from a different verse that you have to take Maaser for the Levi. So what's this new tithe? Obviously it's talking about Maaser Sheini, the second tithe. However, if you look at the chart here, you see that Maaser Sheini is only taken in 4 out of 7 years of the Shemitah cycle. Year 1, year 2, year 4, and year 5. Ubeshana shlishis v'shishis. In the 3rd and 6th year, mafrishin Maaser ani chelef Maaser Sheini. We separate, we put aside the tithe for the poor instead of the second tithe. So there's always going to be a second 10%. The question is if it's called Maaser Sheini and has the laws of Maaser Sheini, or 2 out of the 7 years, it's called Maaser ani, Maaser for the poor. By the way, in the 7th year, the Shemitah year, there is no Maaser because you're not allowed to own or work the land. So it's all ownerless, there's no obligation of Maaser. But years 1, 2, 4, 5 is Maaser Sheini, years 3 and 6 is Maaser ani. The Rebbe points out something very interesting, that the Rambam uses the word mafrishin, set aside. He doesn't say you give it, because there's always 2 stages. You put it aside and then you give it. So with the second tithe, I can understand. Before you eat the produce, you have to put aside all the proper gifts. But with the gift to the poor, it's a funny expression to use the word put aside, because usually you'd think that the gift to the poor only makes a difference if it gets to the poor. It's like tzedakah. You don't just put away the money in your pocket. You have to give it to the poor person, then it becomes tzedakah. But from the fact that the Rambam uses the word set aside, the Rebbe learns an amazing lesson. That there's something about putting something aside for the poor. Even if there's no poor yet, but you have it ready to go, that when a poor person comes into your into contact with you, you have what to give him. And the same thing applies spiritually. We all have what to give to others. Talmud says, Ein ani ela bedat. The ultimate poor person is a poor person of the mind. He lacks knowledge, lacks inspiration. Even if you're in a place or in a situation where there's nobody actively to influence, but in your head, you have to put aside power, time, and effort to dedicate to inspiring yourself so that when you come into contact with someone else, when the poor person comes to you later, you can give them the influence that they need. It's just an ethical lesson from this Rambam. Now, this is going to be the first point where we need to know how Torah decides what a year is. See, for the Truma, the 2% and the 10% to the Levi, those happen every year. Every time you have produce, you give 2% to the Kohen, 10% to the Levi. But once you hit the second tithe, so now you can see it depends which year you're in. Certain years it's the second tithe, certain years it's the poor's tithe. So we have to know what constitutes a year. And this is going to be basically the entirety of this chapter, how Torah defines years with regards to these laws, and depending on which year you're in, will depend on whether you have to give Maaser Sheini or Maaser Ani from this produce. So the Rambam gives us the general rule. And he says like this: it depends whether you're talking about grain and legumes or you're talking about trees. Be'echad b'tishrei hu reish hashana lemaiser tvuos v'kitnios v'yirakos. For tithing grains and legumes and vegetables, the Rosh Hashanah, the demarcation point of what begins a new year, is our classic Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Tishrei. V'chol makom shenemar Rosh Hashanah hu echad b'tishrei. And therefore, in all these laws, whenever we're going to use the word Rosh Hashanah, beginning of the year, we're going to be referring to the first of Tishrei. However, ubachamisha asar bishvat hu Rosh Hashanah lemaiser ha'ilanois. For tithing trees, it's a different demarcation line. It's not the first of Tishrei; it's the 15th of Shvat. Even till today, Tu B'Shvat is celebrated as the New Year for trees. And that's what it means. New Year for trees means that in the times of tithing, that's what sets aside year 2 from year 3. In year 2, you give Maaser Sheini. In year 3, you give Maaser Ani, the gift to the poor. The Rabbi has a letter where he says that from the Rambam here, it seems like the 15th of Shvat is equally biblical like the first of Tishrei. Even though in the Gemara, all that it says is that we know that the New Year for trees has to be after the New Year for regular people. Rosh Hashanah doesn't say when it has to be. So the Rebbe says either it's what we call halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's an oral law transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu straight, like any other amount or time frame in the Torah is all transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai. Or, in this case, the Torah handed off the authority to the sages to decide when the New Year for trees is, and by their power it becomes biblical. And the lesson is that sometimes we're like trees, and we don't always know when is our new year. When are we supposed to begin producing from new? And sometimes we can use a leader or a role model or an inspiration, like the sages, and they'll tell us, hey, now it's time. This is your day. This is your opportunity. Here, start growing your fruit. So we have 2 Rosh Hashanahs. Rosh Hashanah for legumes, grains, vegetables is the first of Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah for trees is 15th of Shvat. What does that mean practically? So here we're going to look at the chart to understand this. Keita, what does this mean? Tvua v'kitnios shehigiu le'oinas ha'maisros lifnei Rosh Hashanah shel shlishis. If you have legumes or grain that reached the time of tithing, which is a third of their growth, that's the phase at which point the grain or legumes themselves becomes obligated to be tithed. If they reach that point before the Rosh Hashanah of the third year, so here we are, this is the second year, it says Shana Shniya, second year. This is the demarcation line, Aleph Tishrei, and they became a third grown already in the second year. Even if they fully ripened and were picked in the third year, mafrishin mehen Maaser Sheini. We separate Maaser Sheini as if they're from the second year, because that's when they reached their third of their growth before their Rosh Hashanah. But if they only reach the phase of tithing, third of their growth, after the Rosh Hashanah of this year, so it crossed the line, and now they're in the third year, and that's when they became a third grown. Mafrishin mehen Maaser Ani. Now they're considered members of the third year, and when you ultimately pick them, you have to separate the tithe for the poor, not Maaser Sheini. That's for legumes, where they follow Aleph Tishrei. V'chein peiros ha'ilon. Same thing applies to the fruit of the tree with a different date. Shabo la'oinas ha'maisros koidem chamisha asar bishvat shel shlishis. If they reach their third of their growth before the 15th of Shvat of the third year, so maybe it would have been better if I would drag the arrow a little bit past, so you can see that it's after Rosh Hashanah. It may even be after Aleph Tishrei, but it's before Tu B'Shvat of the third year. and that's when they reach a third of their growth. Afal pisha nigmeru v'nesfu achar kain b'seif shana shlishis, even if they were ripened and picked later, at the end of the third year, but they got there before Tu B'Shvat, misasrin l'sha'avar. Their tithes are dictated by the previous year. Umafrishin mehen Maaser Sheini, and we separate Maaser Sheini as if they grew in the second year. Same thing on this side. If they reach their phase of tithing during this year, before Tu B'Shvat of the fourth year, Mafrishin mehen Maaser Ani, they're still members of the third year, and we separate the tithe for the poor, because that's when they reach their growth. If they reach a third of their growth after the 15th of Shvat, they take Maaser for the next year. So, the difference here between grains and fruit is only in the date. But the deciding factor is, in both cases, when did they reach a third of their growth? Before their date or after their date? Now, there are some exceptions. Halacha Gimel v'hecharuvin. Here's the first exception, is carob. Yeah, the carobs. Afal pisha chantu perdesein. Koydem chamisha asar b'shvat, even though their fruit budded before the 15th of Shvat, which in other cases of fruit would put them as a member of the previous year, misasrin lehaba. Their Maaser goes according to the next year, later on when they're picked. Hayilu misasris medivrei seifrim, since their obligation to be tithed is only rabbinic. Lee says the Rambam, however, it seems to me that we're talking about over here the carobs that grow in the Tzalmoinite region. They're not really fit for human consumption. They're the ones that have the rabbinic obligation to be tithed. But other carobs, it seems to me that they're biblically mandated. They are like any other fruit of the tree, which has to be tithed according to the laws of the fruit, depending on when it reached a third of its growth. If it's before or after Tu B'Shvat, that's the deciding factor of which year it's following for tithes. Halacha Daled, another exception. Hayarak, vegetables, bishas likitosai isuroi. Very simple. When it's picked, that's when it's tithed. We don't care when it reached a third of its growth, all that. When was it picked? Ketzat. What does that mean? Im nilkat biyoim resh hashana shel shlishis. If it was picked on the day of the new year of the third year, notice that Rambam says it was picked, because you can't say if you pick it. A Jew can't pick vegetables on Rosh Hashanah. It's holiday. But if it was picked, if it was Jewish produce, harvested by a Gentile, and it was picked on the day of Rosh Hashanah, even if it already reached a third of its growth, even if it was fully ripened in the second year, but you picked it in the third, so it's like the third year, you separate the tithe for the poor. It's picked in the fourth year. Again, even if it was ripened fully in the third year, it goes after the fourth year. Maaser Sheini, you separate the second tithe. Halacha Hey, another exception. The esrog, the citrus fruit, is the only one among the fruit of the trees. Harehu kayarak, it's treated like vegetables. And we follow the picking day. Bein l'maiser, bein l'shvius, whether it's related to the laws of tithing or the laws of the Shemitah year. Ketzad, again, what does this mean? Im nilkat bashlishis. If it was picked in the third year, this time it's a fruit of the tree. So the demarcation line is Tu B'Shvat. If it was picked in the third year, Achar Chamisha Asar B'Shvat, after the 15th of Shvat, Mafrishin Mimeno Maaser Ani, Afal Pisha Nigmar Bashniya, we follow its picking time. You separate the tithe for the poor, even though it was finished in the second year, before Tu B'Shvat. Same thing if it was picked in the fourth year, but before the 15th of Shvat, we follow its picking time. Mafrishin Mimeno Maaser Ani, you separate tithe for the poor. Nilkat b'revius achar chamisha asar b'shvat. Once it's picked in the fourth year after the 15th of Shvat, again we follow the picking time. Mafrishim mimeno Maaser Sheini. Now it's year 4, and you're separating the tithe of the second tithe. Halacha vav. The afal pisha hilchin achar likitasai. Even though usually we follow the picking time, there's one exception to that. Esrog bas shishis shenichnasa l'shvius. Let's look at this calendar again. In the 6th year, you're supposed to separate Maaser Ani. In the 7th year, it's Shemitah. There is no Maaser at all. But with the esrog, if it's grown in the 6th year and it enters the 7th, afilu haisa kezayis v'nasis kikikar, even if originally it was like a tiny like an olive, and during the 7th year it became massive like a loaf of bread, chayeves b'maasres. For that one issue, we're going to put it back to the 6th year, and we're going to say it's obligated to be tithed. Unlike fruit picked during the 7th year, which is all exempt, the esrog is obligated. Halacha Zayin, another exception, but this one is even more extreme. Ha'aviyonos shel tzlaf, caper berries. This is a caper bush, and these small berries are the caper berries. Noisnen alehen chumrei ilan v'chumrei zroim. We treat them stringently. We give them the laws of the trees and the laws of plants. Follow this. Sheim hayu mishana shniya shenichnesa lishlishis v'nilketu koidem chamisha asar bishvat. They grew in the 2nd year. Okay? It entered the 3rd year. Now this means it entered past Rosh Hashanah. It's past Rosh Hashanah of the 3rd year. So for grains, that means it's in a new year now, right? But they were picked before the 15th of Shvat. So for the trees, it's not the new year yet. In other words, it's in this point between Rosh Hashanah and the 15th of Shvat where it's a new year for grains, not a new year for trees. Says the Rambam, you must treat it as both. Mafrishin Maaser Rishon, separate the first tithe because that's obvious. That's every year. The Acher Kach, Mafrish Maaser Acher, you take another 10%, but you don't immediately treat it as Maaser Sheini. What do? Upaidehu. You redeem it, which means you transfer its value to money. You treat that money, we'll see in a minute, as Maaser Sheini. The Acher Shepaidehu Noisne La'aniyim. But once you've transferred the money, unlike regular Maaser Sheini, where the fruit loses its holiness and it's all regular, we keep it as Maaser Ani, Maaser for the poor. And you simply eat the money like Maaser Sheini. So in other words, you end up giving two in a way. And it's as if you ended up separating two things, the Maaser Sheini and the Maaser Ani. For the Maaser Sheini, we're treating it like a tree, right? It's not yet Tu B'Shvat, so it's still part of the 2nd year. But for Maaser Ani, we're treating it like a plant. It's after Rosh Hashanah, and therefore it's like the 3rd year, and you have to give Maaser Ani the tithe for the poor. Halacha ches, ha'oirez, v'hadoichan, v'haprogin, v'hashumshimin. Rice, millet, poppy seeds, and sesame seeds. 4 special kind of grain seeds. Afal pisha hishrishu kaidem Rosh Hashanah, even if they took root before Rosh Hashanah of a given year, before Aleph Tishrei, ein hoilchin bahen ela achar gmar hapri. Special law, we only follow the conclusion of the growth of this fruit, of this seed, umisasrin lehaba, and they always are dictated by the next year for tithes. V'chein pail hamitzri, same thing for the Egyptian fava bean. This is a pail hamitzri over here. I'm going to be discussing this at length more in a minute. Afal pisha miktsasei hishrish lifnei Rosh Hashanah umiktsasei la'acharav, even though it partially took root before Rosh Hashanah and it partially took root after Rosh Hashanah, tsoiver garnei l'soichai. What you do is, in the end of the day, you gather all the grain together, v'toiremu Maaser min hakol ke'echad, and you take truma and Maaser from everything as one. Shehakol hoilech achar gemar hapri, because everything follows the end, full ripening of the fruit. In other words, this last line is not an obligation; it's telling you what you could do. At the end of the day, you could take it all together, even though usually you're not allowed to separate truma and Maaser from the produce of one year onto another year. But over here, because it all follows the final ripening stage, when they all finally ripen, take it all together, and you can take truma and Maaser all as one. Halacha tes, habitzalim hasarisim. Bitzalim hasarisim mean impotent onions. Why are they called impotent onions? So the Rambam explains elsewhere that usually when you pick an onion, if you leave it, and you could see this even today, if you leave it for a while in a little bit of a moist place, the onion begins to produce scallions, like these green sprouts, the shoots. Yeah. But there's one species of onion, so writes the Rambam, that are called sarisim. They're impotent because they don't produce scallions, they don't produce these shoots, even if you leave them in a moist place. Yeah, he doesn't identify which species it is. That's what he calls them. Betzalim hasarisim, the impotent onions. Shemana mehem mayim shloishim yaim lifnei Rosh Hashanah. You stopped watering them for 30 days before the new year, before Rosh Hashanah. Vishel Baal, or if they were the same species of onions, but they had to be extra watered. In different regions in Israel would require more watering or less watering. Baal is a place where there's not so much rain, and it relies much more on the irrigation. So here the number is not 30 days, but Shemana mehem shalish oinois lifnei Rosh Hashanah. You stopped watering them 3 periods of watering, whenever if you water them once a week, so 3 weeks, whatever it is, before Rosh Hashanah. Misasrin l'sha'avar. Because you stopped feeding them before Rosh Hashanah, they are treated as the members of the previous year, and the tithes have to be taken from whatever year that is. Second year, third year, whatever it is. Mana mehem paches mikan. If you stopped watering them for less than that time before Rosh Hashanah, afal pisha hischilu livaish kedem Rosh Hashanah, even if they began to dry out before Rosh Hashanah, which seems to indicate the full ripening, misasrin lehaba, their Maaser is taken as members of the next year because you have been watering them close enough to Rosh Hashanah. Okay, and the next halacha Yud, is super complicated, especially the way the Rambam words it. The Talmud Yerushalmi, in this section, has a lengthy discussion, what's called the Sheish Midos, the 6 rules that apply to the Egyptian bean. We're going to be focused on this bean. Like in Talmud Yerushalmi a lot, in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's much debate. It wasn't redacted and edited as much as the Talmud Bavli was, so a lot of parts of it are very difficult to decipher and understand, and you have interpretations of the Talmud that vary from one extreme to the other. So in this sugya, in this discussion of the 6 rules about the Egyptian bean, the commentaries have wide debates about it, and the Rambam, like he does many times, takes completely radical positions that no commentary thought of before, like it's a whole new way of learning the Gemara. Within the Rambam himself, however, in this specific halacha, there's much debate as well. The Ravid, who's like the Rambam's main commentator, usually spends like 1 line or 2 lines when he has issue with the Rambam. Here there's, just in one halacha, there's like 3-4 full comments. So it's a big discussion, this Rambam. There's some question on how to read the words. So although in most standard Rambams it's printed one way, the way we're going to read it today is based on the interpretation of the Chazon Ish from Israel. He and the Rav Chaim Kanievsky, who both spent a lot of time interpreting the Rambams related specifically to agriculture, and the Chazon Ish amends certain parts of the text. So I'm going to be reading it the way he reads it and just point out how it's a little different from our text, just to explain in a smooth and simple manner the laws of the fava bean. Says the Rambam, Poil HaMitzri. The rules, the 6 rules, there are 6 levels when it comes to the Egyptian fava bean. First, we begin with a basic case. Shehevi shlish lifnei Rosh Hashanah. It reaches a third of its growth, which is usually the phase of tithing, before Rosh Hashanah. And the thing with fava beans are that there are 2 parts to the bean. I don't know if it's a fava bean or just Egyptian bean. There are 2 parts to this bean. There's what's called the zera, the seeds, and the yarok, the greens, the green vegetable part of the bean. And it's going to depend on your intention which part of the vegetable you wanted. So the Rambam begins with the case. Again, it reached a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. Im zroi lezera. If you had initially planted it with the intention of only using the seeds, misaser l'sha'avar. So the Maaser is dictated by when it reached a third of its growth, which was before Rosh Hashanah. And again, I'm going to use the example just to keep it simple of year 2 and year 3. Okay? So it reached a third of its growth in year 2 before Rosh Hashanah, and you had in mind to only use the seeds. It's considered part of year 2, and you must give Maaser Sheini. Zroi liyarak. If you planted it only for the greens, you didn't want the seeds, you wanted just the green part of it, then misaser lahaba. Even though it reached a third of its growth in year 2, because you only wanted the vegetable part of it, it's treated like a vegetable. When it's picked, that's what decides the Maaser, and therefore it's a member of year 3 in the example that we're picking, and you give Maaser ani. Now pay close attention. Zroi lezera uliyarak. If you planted it both for the seeds and for the greens, you wanted both. You wanted the seeds and the greens. Oisha zroi lezera, or you planted it initially only for the seeds, and here's the key word the Chazon Ish adds in. After it reached a third, the chashav alav liyarak, after it reached a third of its growth, you change your mind, and you say, hey, you know what? I want to also, another key word that the Chazon Ish adds in, gam, you also wanted to use the greens. So now, and we're going to add this in a minute, but I'm just going to say it now, if you picked it before Rosh Hashanah, so follow this, okay? It's in second year. You had in mind originally for seeds. It reaches a third of its growth. You now change your mind and you also want the greens, and you picked it before Rosh Hashanah. So everything happened during the second year. Maaser mizarei al yarkoi umiyarkoi al zarei. You can put it all together because in the end you want it all, and it reached the third and it was picked in the second year. You put everything together, the seeds and the vegetables, and you take one big Maaser to cover it all. Covers the seeds and the vegetables. Now, skip a line and go to the words V'hu sheliket. That's where we pick up. V'hu sheliket mimenu lifnei Rosh Hashanah. This law, that you can put the tithing all together, is if you picked the beans before Rosh Hashanah, so that it reached a third of its growth, and you picked it before Rosh Hashanah. Avolim liket mimenu achar Rosh Hashanah. But if you picked it after Rosh Hashanah, so in other words, same case, third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. You changed your mind after that, wanted to use it for the greens as well, but you only picked it after Rosh Hashanah. Now, go back a line, not all the way, but Zarai misaser l'sha'avar, v'yarkoi b'shas l'kitasa yisurai. In this case, if you picked it after Rosh Hashanah, so the seeds, which were your original intention, and it reached a third of growth in the second year, is tithed like the second year. But the vegetables, which you only introduced that thought after it reached a third of its growth, and usually vegetables go after picking. In this case, you picked it after Rosh Hashanah, so you follow the picking, and you take the Maaser in the third year. Maaser ani. Now we go even further back and we read those other words. Loi hevi shlish lifnei Rosh Hashanah. If it didn't produce a third of growth before Rosh Hashanah, so nothing happened before Rosh Hashanah, you had in mind originally for seeds, but it only reached a third after Rosh Hashanah. Imzroi lezera. If you initially planted it for seeds, but then changed your mind later and added in the vegetables, now we go back to the continuation of the halacha, bein yarkoi, bein zarai, misaser lahaba. Since everything happened in the third year, both the vegetables and the seeds are taken tithes like they're in the third year, maaser ani. Another case now. Zroi lezera v'chashav olav liyarak. You planted it initially for seeds, but then later you changed your mind to vegetables. So here the Chazon Ish explains. First of all, the second thought happened before it reached a third of its growth. Plus, the change of mind was not to include the greens, but only to go with the greens. So you changed your mind from seeds to greens. Since you changed your mind before it reached a third of its growth, that's the key here, and you only want to use the vegetable now, so we're going to follow your thought. It's an effective thought, and it's going to be treated like vegetables, which will be tithed according to when it's picked. Zroi li yarak. If you initially wanted to plant it for the vegetables, for the greens, and then before it reached a third of its growth, the chashav alav lezera, you changed your mind to include also the seed. This way, when you go from greens to seed, ein machshav zera chala alav. The new thought for seed doesn't take effect unless you do something physical to demonstrate your change of heart. Elohim kein mana mimenu shalosh ariyos. Unless you neglect 3 normal collections of the produce, 3 points of time when you should have collected it, you didn't collect it.
What is ariyos?
Ariyos is likutim, collectings. That's how you show, you really only want it for the seed. Because if you would have wanted it for the vegetables, you would have picked it. You didn't pick it 3 times. Now you've shown that you're doing it for the seeds. But even there, v'hu shehevi shlish lifnei Rosh Hashanah. That's only required if it, in the end, produced a third of its growth before Rosh Hashanah. Avalim loy hevi shlish ala la'acharav. But if it only produced a third of its growth after Rosh Hashanah, afal pisha loy nimna mileres menu shalosh ariyos. And even if you didn't do anything to demonstrate your change of heart, since it only reached a third of growth after Rosh Hashanah, since the bottom line is it's in the third year, so it's treated like the third year, and you only have to take the tithes like the third year. Now, the 6th and final rule when it comes to these beans is an exception to the first one. In the first rule, we said that when you plant something just for the seeds, so you only follow when it reaches a third. Reaches a third before, it's part of year 2, after it's part of year 3. However, zroi lezera, if you initially planted it just for the seeds, and it didn't just reach a third of its growth, v'asa kulai ktsatzin gemurin lifnei Rosh Hashanah, and it all became full growths, fully ripened before Rosh Hashanah, zarai misaser l'sha'avar. So because it's fully ripened, we look at it as if the seeds is totally separate from the vegetables. Zarai misaser l'sha'avar, the seeds indeed have to be tithed according to the previous year. V'yarkei kishas l'kitasai, but the vegetables will go when they're picked, whenever that will be. Miktsasei asa ktsatzin gemurinu miktsasei layasa. If part of it fully ripened, part of it didn't. Zesha amru. In this case, we say tzoyver garner l'soichai. You're allowed to gather your entire granary in one pile. V'nimtza ma'aser mizarei al yarkei miyarkei al zarei, and you can take tithes from the seeds to the vegetables to the seeds. It's all one big produce. You take maaser all together from whatever it is at the complete time of harvesting. Okay, difficult part is behind us. Halacha Yud Aleph. Peiros shana shniya shenis'aravu bepeiros shlishis. In the second year, we take the second tithe, Maaser Sheini. In the third year, we take Maaser Ani, tithe for the poor. What happens if fruit from the second year and from the third year got mixed up? Oishal shlishis b'revius, or the third year and the fourth year got mixed up. You have to know which year it's from to give Maaser Sheini or Maaser Ani. So the Rambam says, Hilchin achar arayv. In this case, you follow the majority. The majority is from the second year, you give second tithe. Right? From the third year, you give the poor tithe. Mechza lemechza, if it's halfway down the middle, mafrish Maaser Sheini min hakoila v'lei Maaser Ani. We'll go on the stringent side. We'll say, take Maaser Sheini, don't take Maaser Ani. Maaser Sheini chamur shaharehu kodesh, Maaser Ani chol. Because the Maaser Sheini is more strict, it's holy, whereas the Maaser gift to the poor is it's mundane, it's regular grain. V'chein peiros shehin safek in peiros shniya hemei peiros shlish. Same thing if you don't have a mixture. You have one set of fruits, but you're in doubt about the fruit. If it belongs to year 2 or year 3, mafrish mihen Maaser Sheini, you only go with the second tithe instead of the tithe for the poor. Halacha Yud Bey, says the Rambam, a general rule that relates to Maaser Sheini. Kol ha-patur mi Maaser Rishon, patur min ha-sheni yamin ha'ani. Any grain that's exempt from the first tithe is also exempt from the second tithe, from the fourth tithe. V'chol shechayav b'rishon, chayav b'shneya. If you're obligated in the first tithe, you're obligated in the other second tithe or poor tithe. V'chol ha-toirem, moitzi Maaser. Any person who's allowed to take truma can take Maaser. V'chol she'enei toirem, enei moitzi Maaser zeh. Anybody who isn't allowed to take truma cannot take this Maaser. Kol mi she'im taram, truma se truma. Any person about whom we said that he shouldn't really take truma, but if he does after the fact it is truma, kach im iser Maaser zeh, harehu Maaser. So too if he takes Maaser Sheini, it's considered Maaser. There was 5 people like that. A person who hears but cannot speak, a person who speaks but cannot hear, a naked person, a drunk person, or a blind person. V'chol mi she'ein truma se truma. Anybody who even after the fact his truma is not considered truma, like a deaf mute, a mentally unstable person, a child, a goy who takes a Jew's truma, or Jew who takes another Jew's truma without permission, kachim hoitzi Maaser zeh, einei Maaser, so too, if he takes this tithe, it's also not considered Maaser Sheini. Halacha Yud Gimel, peiros shehoitzi mehen Maaser Rishon, koidem she'yikavu leMaaser. If fruits were tithed with the first tithe, before they were established for Maaser. Remember that in order to be obligated in Maaser, one of 6 things has to happen to establish it. Either Shabbos comes in, or it's brought home, or it's sold, one of those things. So if you took the first tithe before it became established, you can keep on snacking on the produce even before you take the second tithe, because taking the first tithe doesn't establish the obligation to take the second one. But once the obligation to take tithes was established, something happened to the produce, which makes it obligated. Even if you did take the first tithe, you can no longer snack on it until you take the second tithe or the poor tithe, whatever year it is. Halacha Yud Dalet, the Rambam introduces us to what's coming in the next chapter. Maaser Sheini, the second tithe, hoyil v'to and havas makom. Since it needs to be brought to a specific place to be eaten, which is Yerushalayim, ein mevi'in oisei michutz la'aretz. You cannot bring Maaser Sheini from outside of Israel. Kibcher behema.
Except the one from King David.
Even those, we'll see. Even those, yeah. Kibcher behema. Just like a firstborn animal that has to be brought only within Israel. Lefichach, therefore, lo yichivu lehafrish Maaser Sheini b'Syria. Even in Syria, those areas that were usually like halfway like Israel, we don't take Maaser Sheini in Syria. It seems to me, says the Rambam, the fact that we do take the second tithe in Babylon and in Egypt, even though they're also not part of Israel, we should redeem them, transfer their holiness to money, and bring the money to Jerusalem. And it also seems to me, the only reason that they obligated these places to bring the second tithe is not because there's an inherent obligation there, it's to attach significance to the tithe for the poor, which we do want the Jews to give in Babylon and Egypt, so that the poor people over there can rely on them. In Syria, which is right near Israel, no need for that. They'll go to Israel and get their tzedakah money. But once you're in Egypt or in Babylon further out, you have to have a way to establish Maaser Ani, which only happens if they give Maaser Sheini. Therefore, the sages said, give Maaser Sheini, redeem the money, and bring it to Yerushalayim.